Hello and welcome to this episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I'm your creepy host, Jaime Bennett. And on this episode of Belongs to the Shadows, I will be talking to you all about horror movies that were based on real-life events. I'm going to be talking about The Exorcist, The Conjuring, and The Warrens, as well as a haunted doll. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy this episode. The first scary story that I would like to approach that a movie was based upon is the true story behind the movie The Exorcist. There has been much mystery that has surrounded Roland Doe, and over 75 years later, experts believe the boy is actually Ronald Hunklear, a former NASA engineer who helped with the 1969 moon landing. Hunklear had died of a stroke just a month shy of his 86th birthday in the year of 2020. He had passed away in his Marysville, Maryland home. After the series of exorcisms that Hunklear had went through as a child, he had actually become incredibly successful in his career as an adult working for NASA, and he had helped patent the technology to make space shuttle panels resistant to extreme heat for the Apollo missions of the 1960s. You can find that in the New York Post. Not many people had known about his secret identity, except for the few close friends and professors, as well as Jesuits who knew the priests who performed the exorcism. According to his partner, Hunklear had always been very worried that his coworkers would find out, and he would even leave his home every Halloween because he was terrified that someone would harass him. Hunklear retired from NASA in the year 2001 after almost 40 years of service, and he had lived a quiet life during that time. How did The Exorcist adapt Roland's story for the movie? The author, William Blady, who passed away in 2017, got the idea for the movie The Exorcist when studying at Georgetown University. A professor had a lecture about exorcisms in class. Specifically, he had mentioned Roland's story. The lecture mentioned a diary that one of the priests had in his possession, and he was able to get a copy of this priest's diary. Blady also contacted Reverend William Bowdern, the priest who performed the exorcism, and with this information, he was able to adapt Roland's story. Blady's novel was released in 1971. It topped the bestsellers list and stayed there for about 4 months. And then a couple of years later, William Friedkin contacted Blady to turn it into a film. So therefore, Blady ended up writing the script. What The Exorcist had kept and had changed about the true life story. Many horror movies pay homage to The Exorcist now, but the thought of an exorcism did not always appease to audiences. To keep Roland's identity as a secret, Blady had changed a few things. Roland became a 12-year-old girl instead of the 14-year-old boy that he was, and Regan's mother was changed to a single parent as opposed to having a large family. That violent outbursts and Roland's creepy, low-toned voice all occurred, but the infamous ceiling crawl and head spinning had never fully been confirmed or denied to have happened. The Exorcist true story had happened in The Exorcist true story. They didn't confirm it, nor did they deny it. So, I mean, it still could be true. You never know. That's scary to think that a young gentleman went through that. And if that is true, about the ceiling crawling and the head spinning, that is extremely terrifying. This is terrifying to begin with, but I could not imagine if that is true. That's extremely terrifying. Another thing that does not occur is the X that had appeared in scratches on Ronald's chest, signifying that the 10 demons that had possessed Roland. The cuts on Roland's skin saying the words Lewis was changed to help me, taking away the fundamental aspect of moving to St. Louis. I know one of my favorite YouTubers had actually done a story about The Exorcist, and they visited St. Louis because some of his story, the person that this had happened to in real life, did take place in St. Louis. There were a few things that were left out. Blady kept much of The Exorcist true story closely tied to the novel. The things that were left out included both Roland and Regan acting oddly after playing with an Ouija board, only acting strange at night, as well as the two acting extremely violent when any religious objects were presented to them. The Exorcist book and film are very closely connected. Blady did write the script, but the true story of Hunklier is a bit different from the film. In the end, the true terrifying story of Regan is much more terrifying than the novel or film, as a young child went through such a terrible, horrific experience. And like I said, one of my favorite YouTubers had actually covered this story, and they said that some of it did take place in St. Louis. It started off in Maryland, and then it was said that they had found the word Lewis carved somewheres, and so they took that as a sign, like the family took that as a sign to move to St. Louis. So that's where the other half of the story supposedly takes place. So like I said, some of The Exorcist and the story that The Exorcist was based upon did take place in St. Louis, Missouri, or so they say. The following phrases described here that I'm about to read to you describe an exorcism that took place in March and April of 1949. A Jesuit priest affiliated with the St. Louis University, led by Father William S. Bodern, the pastor of St. Francis Xavier Church, undertook an exorcism of a 14-year-old boy. They took turns praying over the boy, working to cast out the demon that they believed possessed him. This was a real-life exorcism that was the inspiration for the 1971 novel called The Exorcist and the film by the same name. But the novel and film were mostly the product of William Peter Blady's imagination, which I had said earlier. He did change a few of the things in the script. He changed the setting of the exorcism to DC instead of it being in Maryland or St. Louis. and the child was made into a 12-year-old girl instead of the 14-year-old boy that it had actually happened to, like I said earlier. The contrast of these two works, fiction, author Thomas Allen had wrote a history of the St. Louis exorcism called Possessed, the true story of an exorcism, based on a meticulous 26-page diary kept by Reverend Raymond J. Bishop. The book had first been published in 1993, but is now the interest to a new generation not familiar with the events. How the Exorcist events took place. In January of 1949, the strange events at the home of the young boy in Maryland had taken place. The author Thomas Allen writes, mysterious things began to happen when the child was present. A coat hanger seemed to have flown out of the closet. A Bible seemed to have risen from a bookcase. And one day, the kitchen table tipped over. After some of the other events, an exorcism was sought for the child, and a local priest had agreed to perform it. He was from Georgetown University Hospital. And what happened next had went terribly wrong. After strapping the kid down and commencing to pray, the boy got a hold of a spring from the bed, broke it off, and slashed the priest's arm from shoulder to wrist. The priest then required 100 stitches. Soon after that, the boy's family, which had strong ties to St. Louis, came to the city after finding bloody scratches on the child's chest, spelling Lewis. So there's where I was getting the whole carving of Lewis. I wasn't exactly sure what the complete story was, but there's where I got it from. In St. Louis, the exorcism, which had occurred over a 2-month span, began in a private home. Later, the exorcism had taken place on the campus of St. Louis University in the Alexander Brothers Hospital, in a wing that was demolished later in 1978. Thomas Allen had came to St. Louis to talk about the exorcism at an event held at St. Louis University, and he acknowledged the strange occurrences documented by the priest, had personally remained skeptical that the child was possessed by a demon. So yeah, it is amazing that, the exorcism that inspired, the Exorcist movie could be tied to the St. Louis exorcism. It's terrifying to think that, this could actually happen in real life. I know that when I watched the movie The Exorcist when I was younger, yes, I did a no-no and actually watched it when I was a child, scared me half to death. I would pray and pray and pray and pray because I did not want to be possessed by a demon. And it's, it's no laughing matter. It's not a joke. It's terrifying to know that these things could actually happen, and that it did actually happen to a young 14-year-old boy. The original Exorcist movie was released December 26 of 1973, and there were reports of when people went to see it in the movie theater, of people getting sick to their stomachs, of people having to walk out of the movie theater, of people actually passing out from witnessing what was happening on the movie screen. It was that shocking to their system that people were actually passing out, they were getting sick, and some people had to leave the movie theater. So I felt it only necessary, since that this is an episode of, true life stories, true life events, that have been made into horror films, I felt it necessary to mention Ed and Lorraine Warren. Yes, demonologist Ed Warren and medium and clairvoyant person Lorraine Warren. I'm going to be talking about The Conjuring and the true life story behind the movie The Conjuring. Let's talk about Ed Warren and a little bit of his background. Ed Warren had been a World War II veteran and also a former police officer who had become self-professed demonologist after he had studied the subject on his own. His wife, Lorraine, claimed to be clairvoyant and a medium who was capable of being able to communicate with the demons that Ed had discovered. The family that actually lived in the house that is involved in The Conjuring was known by the last name of Perrin. So it was the Perrin family house. In 1952, Ed and Lorraine founded the New England Society for Psychic Research. That is the oldest ghost hunting group in New England. They had quickly gained notoriety as respected paranormal investigators after their initial investigation of the Amityville hauntings, which I will be talking about a little bit later in this episode. Their two most famous cases, however, were heavily popularized by the Conjuring franchise. A series of movies that had focus on Ed and Lorraine's experiences exorcising demons from two possessed families. Though the movies had seemed over-dramatized and impossible to believe, the Warrens had maintained that all of the events depicted actually transpired, though Ed had died in 2006. Lorraine became a consultant on the film and claimed that she didn't let the directors take any more dramatic license than what was necessary. Nevertheless, the true story of The Conjuring remains almost unbelievable and chilling to this day. Here's the true story of The Conjuring, the family that was involved, the Perrin family. The true story of The Conjuring, or the true story behind The Conjuring, begins with the first film, which focused on the Perrin family. In January of 1971, the Perrin family had moved into a 14-room farmhouse in Harrisfield, Rhode Island, where Carolyn, Roger, and their 5 daughters began to notice strange things were occurring almost immediately after they had moved in. It started small. Carolyn would notice that the broom went missing or seemed to have moved from place to place on its own. She would hear the sound of something scraping against the kettle in the kitchen when no one else was there. She'd find small piles of dirt in the center of a newly cleaned kitchen floor. The girls had begun to notice spirits around the house, though for the most part they were harmless. There were a few, however, that seemed very, very angry. Carolyn allegedly researched the history of the home and had discovered that it had been in the same family for 8 generations, and that many of them had died under mysterious or terrible circumstances. Several of the children had drowned in a nearby creek. One was murdered, and a few of them hanged themselves in the attic. That's terrible. That is extremely terrible. There is a spirit that was depicted in the film by the name of Bathsheba. Was the worst of all of them. Whoever the spirit was, she was perceived to be the mistress of the house, and she resented the competition that the mother posed for that position. said Andrea Perrin, the oldest of the 5 daughters. It turns out that there was actually a real person named Bathsheba Sherman who had lived on the parents' property in the mid 1800s. She was rumored to have been a Satanist, and there was evidence that she had been involved in the death of a neighbor's child. Though no trial had ever taken place, she was buried in a nearby cemetery of a Baptist church in downtown Harrisville. The parents believed that it was Bathsheba's spirit that was tormenting them. According to Andrea, the family experienced other spirits as well as smelled rotting flesh and would cause beds to rise off the floor. She claimed her father would enter the basement and feel cold, like a cold, stinking presence behind him. They often stayed away from the dirt-floored cellar, but the heating equipment had often failed mysteriously, causing Roger to venture down into the basement. Over the 10 years that the family had lived in the house, the Warrens made multiple trips to investigate it. At one point, Lorraine conducted a seance to attempt to contact the spirits that had been possessing the family. During the seance, Carolyn Perrin became possessed, speaking in tongues and rising from the ground in her chair. Andrea claimed to have secretly witnessed the seance. In her own words, I'm quoting Andrea here. She said, "I thought I was going to pass out," Andrea said. "My mother began to speak a language not of this world in a voice not of her own. Her chair levitated and she was thrown across the room." Though the movie had a version of the events that had Ed performing an exorcism rather than a seance, Lorraine insisted that she and her husband would never attempt one, as they must be performed by Catholic priests. So that's where, the movie differed from real life events. So Ed and Lorraine never did an exorcism. They only did the seance. After the seance had been performed, Roger kicked the Warrens out, worried about his wife's mental stability. According to Andrea, the family continued to live in the house due to financial problems until they were able to move out in 1980, at which point the spirits were silenced and the hauntings had ceased. So the Conjuring house has actually sold since. It has actually sold for $1.5 million, way over the asking price. So $1.5 million over the asking price. And the farmhouse is located in Rhode Island, if you're not familiar with its location. And it was the real life setting story, the story that took place there that inspired the 2013 horror movie, The Conjuring. And like I said, it sold for more than $1.5 million, which is 27% above the original asking price. The colonial era home was the site of the alleged hauntings that had plagued the Perrin family in the 1970s, which, I previously talked about. The details of their story, of course, was dramatized for the director James Wayne's beloved flick, The Conjuring. The Conjuring does depict a family moving into their dream home in Rhode Island, but they had soon found themselves dealing with haunted supernatural activity. The family had hired paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren to deal with the malevolent and violent spirits. That The house is located in Burrillville, Rhode Island. That's where the Perrin family experienced the now famous haunting. The property had supposedly been the site of murders and suicides, and a number of spirits are said to be haunting the grounds of the Conjuring house. But that did not discourage Boston real estate developer Jacqueline Nunez one bit. Nunez had made one of 10 offers for the 3-bedroom, approximately 3,100 square feet, for the house in September of 2021. The original asking price was $1.2 million, but after some negotiation, the bill of sale had been signed off at $1.5 million. The sellers, Jen and Corey Heinzen, bought the home in 2019, and they had bought it for $439,000, meaning that the sale was almost 250% more than the price that they had paid for it. The Heinzens moved in. They told the Wall Street Journal that they had spent about 4 months keeping themselves to one room. And, there is tellings of the story on YouTube with some famous YouTubers. There's a few famous YouTubers that do ghost hunts, and they have stayed overnight in the Conjuring home, and they have interviewed the Heinzens, and the Heinzens did admit in this interview that they did stay to one room to begin with. They wanted to do it as a sign of respect for the spirits. They didn't want the spirits to see them as barging in on their space. They wanted to be respectful. But still, they had experienced paranormal activity. The Heinzens described seeing black-colored figures one night. And once they had realized that they were both awake and both seeing it, it had disappeared. That's what Corey Heinzen had told the Wall Street Journal. The pair also said that they had witnessed flashes of lights in rooms that didn't have lights in them, and heard unexplained footsteps as well as knocking. When the Heinzens sold the home to Nunez, they had one unique stipulation, and that stipulation was of the conditions of sale. Whoever bought this could not live here year-round. Nunez said via the Providence Journal, so you can find that statement in the Providence Journal. Instead, Nunez will carry on the Heinz's business of running daytime tours and allowing paranormal investigators to occupy the house to do their investigation at night, as well as running live stream events. Honestly, truth be told, I really like paranormal stuff, but I don't think that I would have the guts to stay overnight in the Conjuring home, especially after watching the famous YouTubers do it. I just don't think that I would have the nerves to do that. Nunez had said that this was a very personal purchase, and when it hit the market, they thought that the property enabled people to speak to the dead. They're not afraid of the house, and as of now, but Nunez said ask again in a year. Give it some time. So yeah, that's interesting. The Conjuring house was actually sold, and I had watched a YouTube episode the other day that took place in the Conjuring home, because this particular YouTuber had done a ghost investigation. They were one of the first ghost investigators from YouTube to go in the home, I guess. They kind of paved the way for the other investigators to go in the home. And since the family who had it sold it, they went back and kind of had a going away party with the family that had sold it, because that family had allowed them to come into the home originally and do the ghost investigations. So I thought that was interesting that they had a going away party, and there's a table located in the home, and they all carved their names in this table. And one of the people is going to take it back to their home and keep it there, as kind of, I guess, a souvenir, a remembrance of the home. Because, they had been together for quite a while, working at this place and doing the tours, and, they had worked together for a while. So I just thought that was interesting that, one of them was going to be taking the table home that had, people's names carved into it. The last story that I'm going to be telling you is about a very, very haunted doll that is located in Florida. The doll's name is Robert. And here is the story behind the world's most terrifying haunted doll. And this comes from an article written by Andy Wright. And it came out October 25th of 2021. So I'm getting this from the atlasobscura.com, and you can read more about it there. So here we go. This is the story behind the most terrifying haunted doll. Like I said, he's located in Key West, Florida, and is considered to be one of the world's most cursed objects. The thing about this doll, and the reason why he is so terrifying, is because, and it'll probably say it in this article, like I'd heard about this doll before, but you're supposed to ask the doll's permission before you even take pictures of him. And if you do not ask his permission, bad things will start happening to you. And located on the wall outside of his glass case are letters from people who did not ask his permission and took his photo without his permission and had started having bad things happen to them. So they are sending apology letters, and the letters are outside of his glass case located on the wall. It's decorating the wall now. So he is terrifying, and he's supposed to be a little boy in a sailor suit, and his face is very, very worn out, and he only looks vaguely human. He has a nub nose that looks like a pair of pinholes, and he is covered in brown nicks that are kind of like scars. His eyes are black and beady, and he wears a malevolent smirk. So he's smiling kind of evilishly. His hands are clasped in his lap, and he's holding his own toy, which is a dog, with garish popping eyes and a too big tongue lolling out of its crazy shaped mouth. There are some other things that people also agreed to be true about Robert, that he's very much haunted, and that he has caused car accidents, broken bones, job loss, divorce, and a cornucopia of a whole bunch of other misfortunes. He is said to be 117 years old as of 2021. So he's coming up on his 118th birthday. and he lives at the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. He's in a new display case, which was recently donated by someone who is a huge fan of Robert's. That comes from Corey Convertito, the curator. Hopefully I pronounced their name right. The curator of the museum. The comfortable new digs is Robert's comfortable new digs is completed with humidity control, UV filtering glass to preserve the artifact, and it did not seem to have reformed Robert. The museum still gets regular reports of evils attributed to the doll. How crazy is that? I would not want to take a picture of Robert. I wouldn't even want to take a picture of Robert. Even if I asked his permission and got his permission, I still would not want to take a picture of Robert. But if you look in this article, they do have a picture of Robert, and I will try my very best to insert a photo of Robert so that you all can see the doll that I am speaking of. Before Robert had came to the museum in 1994, he had been the property of Robert Eugene Otto, an eccentric artist and a prominent member of the Key West family. Yes, the doll and the owner had the same name. Isn't that crazy? Robert and Robert. That's very, very interesting. But the boy had answered to Jean. Robert was a childhood birthday gift from Otto's grandfather, who had bought the doll during a trip to Germany. Otto's relationship with the doll had continued into adulthood. But what people really remember is what they probably term as an unhealthy relationship with the doll, says Convertito. He brought it everywhere. He talked about it in first person and as if he weren't a doll. He was Robert, as in he is a living entity. And some kids do that. Some kids, they'll get like a stuffed dog and treat it as if it's a real living being. After some digging into Robert's past, the museum had traced Robert's origins to the Steiff Company, the same toy maker that had first manufactured a teddy bear in honor of Theodore Roosevelt. I remember hearing about that teddy bear. That's very, very interesting. I did not know that. So Robert was most likely never intended to be sold as a toy. A Steiff historian had told the museum that Robert was probably part of a set fabricated for window display of clowns or gestures. How interesting is that? Like, I thought Robert was originally created as a toy, so I'm hearing about this the first time as I'm telling it to you all. So that's pretty interesting. That's kind of adorable. Especially with Robert's impish behavior, it kind of suits his personality really well. Robert's little sailor suit was not supplied by the company. It was probably an outfit that Otto had at one point wore himself as a child. According to the legend, young Otto began to blame mishaps on the doll. So, like, whenever I guess Otto would get in trouble, he would say Robert did it. While this could have been laughed off as a child storytelling, adults also had started noticing odd occurrences, especially as Otto and Robert had grown older. As an adult, Otto lived in a stately home he had called the Artist House, where Robert could be seen positioned at the upstairs window. So school children swore up and down that the doll would appear and reappear in the window. They had avoided the house at all costs. I don't really blame them. I would be the same way. I'd be like, oh my gosh, that doll is moving, or somebody's playing in some kind of cruel prank. Myrtle Reuter had purchased the artist's house after Otto's death in 1974 and had also become Robert's new caretaker. Visitors swore they had heard footsteps in the attic and giggling. Some claimed Robert's expression would change when anyone badmouthed Otto in his presence. Reuter said Robert would move around the house on his own, and after 20 years or so of antics, she donated him to the museum. But far from banishing Robert to obscurity, his arrival to the museum had marked a turning point for the doll. Since Robert had arrived, visitors have flocked to the museum to get a look at this mischievous doll. He had appeared on TV shows. He had his aura photographed. He is a stop on a ghost tour. He had inspired a horror movie. He has a Wikipedia entry and social media accounts. Fans can buy Robert replicas, books, coasters, and t-shirts. The most adventurous can even volunteer to be locked in with Robert after dark. I don't know about that. I mean, I love ghost stories, and I love, this show belongs to the shadows. That's what it's based on, but I don't think that I would even have the guts for that. I'm sorry. I'm kind of a coward. I don't think, when it comes to creepy dolls, I do not think that I can handle that one. Good luck to those who can. And people can, and they do, write Robert. He gets probably, they say, 1 to 3 letters every day. The curator of the museum had said that that's about how many letters Robert receives every day. They're not typical fan letters. They're often apologies, like I had said earlier. And many visitors attribute post-visit misfortunes to failing to respect Robert, or even openly disrespecting Robert. And they write letters begging him for his forgiveness. Others ask him for advice or to hex those who have wronged them. The curator has said that they have received more than 1,000 letters, which they keep and catalog. Robert also receives emails and homages. At some point, it had become known that Robert had a sweet tooth, so people leave and send him candy. Once he received a box containing 8 bags of peppermints, a card, and no return address. Exercising caution, the museum staff does not consume treats sent to Robert. I don't blame them. I don't think that I would trust treats sent in the mail. You never know. Guests also leave him sweets, money, and occasionally joints. Yeah. The caretaker says it's completely inappropriate. They are still a museum. Probably some people, thinking that it'd be funny to leave Robert something of that nature. The caretaker of Robert is the museum curator, and once a year she administers a checkup, taking him out of the case and weighing him to assess whether the humid Florida weather has adversely affected his straw-filled body. She also is his proxy, receiving, reading, and all of his emails and letters, and running social media feeds. They said, they reported several years ago, she had photoshopped Robert's knobby face onto the now famous picture of Kim Kardashian popping a bottle of champagne into a glass balanced on her behind. And in order to attract attention to the campaign, that would score the museum a grant if they garnered enough votes. Through the combined forces of the Kardashians and Robert's celebrity and the doll's social media reach, he has reached almost 9,000 Facebook likes. The museum won by a landslide. So that's awesome. I mean, they got what they needed. Got as many votes as they needed to win. So that's pretty cool. Occasionally, the curator will correspond on Robert's behalf. She tries to send something to every child who writes him. Gene had always had that childlike temperament around him, and they feel like Robert would want to be kind to children. She also responded to more poignant ones, such as an email from a girl who was being bullied at school. So the caretaker of Robert does she think that he's haunted is the question. And she says in this article that she doesn't know. She really don't. She says she had never had a bad experience with him. She had never felt uncomfortable. It always been a very basic relationship, and she had a job to do, has a job to do, and she goes and does it. And whether there's something to it or not, he just allows her to get on with her job. So I guess that's a really good way of looking at it, if you're working in a place like that with a haunted object or a cursed object, that's probably the best way of looking at it if you believe in those sorts of things. I know that there are some people out there that are very skeptical. I know there are some people who had been skeptics and had something happen to them in the supernatural realm, and they started believing. So, it is what it is. I always find these stories to be extremely, extremely interesting, is all I can say. It's just one of those things that just fascinates me, and I don't know why. I will devour YouTube after YouTube after YouTube show of ghost hunters and, haunted history and haunted dolls and cursed artifacts. I find all that stuff fascinating, and I respect it. I respect it because I do believe that there are things that happen that we cannot explain. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I hope it was informational, educational, and creepy. Until next time, stay spooky.